Okay, hello everybody. Go ahead and start up now since it's 5 o'clock. We're gonna get this going on time. So yeah, this is the left debate on basic income, guaranteed income, guaranteed jobs, and automation. And I'll be chairing this. My name is Scott Santens. And our first speaker here today is Michael Howard from the University of Maine. He's also the president of USBIG, and he's going to talk about the left debate on basic income.
Okay, thank you all for coming. The title is, of course, maybe promises more than can be delivered. I'm mainly going to be focusing on a debate that's taken place in the journal Catalyst between David Kalditsky, a proponent of basic income, and Alex Gurevich and Lucas Stanchik, who have been critics. They were all invited to come to the Congress, but none of them could make it, so you have me. The particular dimension of left arguments around basic income that I'm going to focus on is the argument that has to do with exit. And I'll say first off that when I'm talking about basic income, I'm not talking about right-wing versions of it that would scrap the welfare state and introduce a basic income, but the net effect is to make people worse off. What I am focusing on is the idea that a basic income, while it could be ameliorative and it could improve our solutions to certain problems, that it would also be emancipatory in the sense that it would put in motion processes that would lead to further transformations, and in particular be emancipatory by enabling people to say no to undesirable forms of work or to abusive relationships. Objections to basic income on this point is that it would cost too much, or that if it were at an affordable cost, it would not support exit, and in fact then would not be emancipatory. And the further dimension is that there are alternatives to basic income that are more efficient, more fair, or more ecologically sustainable. So, on the cost question, Gurevich and Stanchik estimate that a basic income at $15,000 per person, which they think is the minimum to be really emancipatory, would take 26% of GDP. But they fail to take adequate account of the difference between gross and net cost. And so to address that, I'm going to refer to Carl Widerquist's back-of-the-envelope calculation. And first, to clarify what I mean by net versus gross cost, let's imagine that we have a basic income that's going to cost, say, $3 trillion. And there will be, on the right-hand side of the screen, there will be some people who are net contributors who pay more toward the scheme than they get in basic income, and there will be net beneficiaries, people who get more from basic income than they're paying in taxes. Now let's suppose that the net contributors pay into the scheme as a group $2 trillion. They all get a basic income, so they get $1 trillion, but they are contributing a net $1 trillion. The net beneficiaries, some of them will be paying into the scheme. Let's say they pay in $1 trillion as a group, but they get $2 trillion back, so as a group they're getting net $1 trillion. So there's a net transfer from the contributors to the beneficiaries of $1 trillion. So the net cost is $1 trillion, not $3 trillion. Although in the budget line item it looks like $3 trillion. So that's the difference between net versus gross cost. So to see how this works out with an actual scheme, Carl Widerquist looks at a $12,000 basic income for every adult, half of that for children. That would be a break-even point of $55,000. That's the household average, where you'd be getting about as much as you're paying in. The gross cost of that would be over $3 trillion, but the net cost is actually about 1/6 of that, and it's only 3% of GDP. Now, a much more generous basic income of $20,000 per adult, and half that for children, has a much higher break-even point. Households up to $100,000 are going to be net beneficiaries, but the gross cost of that is going to be over $5 trillion. The net cost, though, is about 1/3 of that, and still less than 10% of GDP. So since Gurevich and Stanchik's idea falls between 1 and 2, we can safely say that the net cost for those who are net contributors is going to be somewhere between 3 and 10% of GDP, not 26%. An important caveat about Carl Widerquist's calculation is that he assumes a surtax on the earned incomes of net beneficiaries of 50%. And this, I think, weakens the exit option progressively as one moves up in the middle class. You're going to be losing a lot more if you lose your job and you have only the basic income. So if you wanted to reduce this tax on the low end of the net beneficiaries, you're going to increase the cost for the net contributors. And the question then is, how much can the exit option be expanded before the tax rates on the net contributors become unsustainable, either economically or politically? Can the US economy add another, I'll try to come back to that question, but I'll simply say there's a lot of room to raise taxes. Piketty and Saez, experts on inequality, say the marginal tax rate on the upper income could be raised to as much as 83% without deleterious economic effects from the 30-some% where it has been. So can the US economy add another 3 to 10% of GDP to current taxation and spending? Well, current US government spending is about 39% of GDP. How does this compare with other capitalist countries? An additional 3% would put us in the same camp as Canada or Poland. An additional 10% would bring us to the level of Portugal, and still we'd be quite a bit below that of Scandinavian countries, particularly Finland. So 3 to 10% does, I should add, does not even consider possible savings from redundant welfare expenditures, cutting defense spending, and other ways of reducing costs. That's just if this is a pure add-on. So it certainly seems to be within the realm of what's possible within a capitalist economy. Now, Gurvich and Stanchik argue a basic income high enough to be genuinely liberating for the low-wage worker would require enormous expropriation of businesses and wealthy people. Consequently, there's no chance of UBI's passage until there's a working class with the social and organizational power already adequate to extract it. So they say we should focus on organizing. Basic income is for a distant future. In response to this, first of all, as I've tried to argue, the cost is rather exaggerated in the way that they're talking for, even though they do at one point in a footnote admit the distinction between gross and net cost. Point I would want to make is one does not need to start with a full basic income. It does somewhat weaken the exit option, but I don't think it makes it utterly irrelevant. Working class power will be resisted whether you're giving it to people in the form of a basic income or a job guarantee or reformed labor law. People who stand to lose profits will fight all of those. So I don't think basic income needs to be singled out. You can pursue organizational power and lofty policy options at the same time. So why say you have to choose between one or the other? So the question then is basic income something that's going to advance these efforts or not? Okay. Another argument having to do with exit is made by Davis-Valera and Birnbaum. They ask us to consider the effect of basic income on different categories of workers. They argue that exit is not really plausible for people who value the non-monetary aspects of a job. The fact that they have a basic income to fall back on means it's not going to matter much if what they really value is the intrinsic aspects of the job. And more importantly, the most vulnerable workers, those at the low end of the labor market, having a basic income may not really give them an exit option because they're not exiting from work altogether, they're exiting from one job to another, and the options aren't that different. And moreover, do they have a threat against their employer? Not if they're easily replaced. So therefore, security at that end of the labor market may require a lot more than just income security. Second point they make is that there's a danger of weakening solidarity. If the more privileged can use a basic income to make an individual exit from employment, it means they may have less solidarity with people who can't make an individual exit, can only exit collectively, but now they're left simply with a weakened voice because they no longer have solidarity with those who've chosen the exit and can actually exercise it. Okay, the main point I would want to make in response to this is exit is not all or nothing. As David Kalnitsky has pointed out, there are modest forms of exit, temporary withdrawal, work slowdowns and strikes, where having some cushion of economic security can reduce the cost of lost wages and reduce the cost associated with the risk of being fired when you take such actions. So as he says, it becomes somewhat easier to be picky, to temporarily exit, to bargain from a less desperate position. And as far as solidarity, he also points out here, based on the empirical evidence, 5 minutes, the income experiment in Dauphin, Canada, typically separated groups were brought together under a unified scheme, and the boundaries between former welfare recipients, the unemployed, and the working poor began to blur, which in part accounted for its overwhelming popularity. And this may be the key point. Unconditionality matters more than generosity. It brings supporters on board, and it builds up a constituency for further increases. It builds bridges and builds power. So even a more modest basic income than some of the schemes we've heard about begins to change the conversation. And in that way, I think it's potentially a transformative reform, even if it doesn't give people complete exit. Other evidence from Alaska's Permanent Fund, Jones and Marinescu found that while there was a zero net effect on labor market participation, when you broke this down into different groups, some people withdrew from employment, but on the other hand, the downward distribution of funds toward people with a higher marginal propensity to consume led to growth that gave others the opportunity to work somewhat more. So people, even with a $2,000 basic income, they do choose to exit in ways that they couldn't before, and it opens up opportunities for others, and these two groups can see each other in a kind of mutually beneficial relationship. I won't have much time to talk about alternatives, but generally people talk about basic services, work time reduction, state as employer of last resort. All I would want to claim here is that the policies, these policies which have their own merits, should not be considered an exhaustive list. At some level, basic income should be part of the mix. There are lots of arguments for, good arguments for universal services, particularly in the areas of education, healthcare, and public transportation. But beyond basic needs, the diversity of people's needs is an argument in favor of giving people cash. There will always be some level of cash transfers, so the question we should be asking is, should these cash transfers be conditional or unconditional, universal or targeted? In his critique of basic income, Goff argues that we should have conditions because participation in productive and reproductive activities is important for collective welfare, self-respect, and socialization. And for that reason, he's inclined to embrace a participation income, but at the same time, he recognizes the administrative challenges of having a participation scheme, and so he wants to scrap both participation income and basic income and go for work time reduction and jobs. But why not see basic income as a pragmatic way to implement a participation income? In other words, you're not doing it on the principle that people should not contribute to society. You're going on the principle that most people will contribute to society, and it's worth the cost of a few people who don't in order to achieve that effect. Lastly, on work time reduction, the ecological benefit is that trading pay increments for more disposable time limits the rise in consumption and thus emissions. If we want to bring down carbon emissions, we got to bring down consumption, and we have to reduce incomes overall to do that. This might be an argument for mandatory reduction of work time, but Von Parijs and Van der Borcht have noted various dilemmas or difficulties in implementing a mandatory work time reduction scheme. I'm not going to walk through those because I don't have time, but I'll simply say that whether you go for mandatory work time reduction or you want to have it happen in some voluntary way, universal basic income can complement a mandatory scheme, or more interestingly, it can make work time reduction possible in ways that are not decreed from above but are worked on by people in arrangements from below. And how much time? 1 minute. So I think I'll just wrap it up there, and we can maybe explore some of the other alternatives during discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. So next up is Franziska Riepl from the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and she'll be talking about the response of labor unions to basic income.
Alright, so my name is Franziska Riepl. I'm a student at the University of Louisiana at Lafayette, and in my research I've looked at the response of labor unions to universal basic income for two reasons. First of all, they are, even though they are losing some power, still a pretty major interest group, especially when it comes to making any kind of economic policy. They're very important in the policy-making process. And secondly, usually you kind of perceive basic income as a project of the left, and usually you would think labor unions are supportive of basic income, but usually they aren't, so that's somewhat surprising. Because what I found in my research is that most labor unions reject basic income on the grounds that it will not deliver the expected positive effects that we've surely all heard about, while bearing considerable risks. And basic income also contradicts the union's traditional values and is seen as a threat to their power. So what I did is, first of all, I looked at different countries, how the basic income debate evolved there and what labor unions said about it, and then I sorted all those arguments and brought one into an economic framework and kind of compared them with the theory there, and then also a value or philosophical framework. And I'll start with some observations from different countries, and I'll focus on three just to make it shorter, and we'll start with the United States. So in the United States, unions are generally uninterested. I looked at all the websites of the 10 major unions, and not a single one had an official statement on their website. 3 of them mentioned it in some way, but there's not really an official policy on it. The only exception to this is Andrew Stern. He's the ex-president of the Service Employees International Union, and he wrote a book called Raising the Floor, where he advocates for basic income, saying that we all need a bold alternative solution like UBI to address challenges in the labor market, especially with the job loss that we're expecting. And he's trying to get unions on board, but they don't really respond to it, and since he's an ex-president of the union, we can't really count him as a real supporter from the union side. And to sum it up, I have 2 quotes from Richard Trumka, the head of the AFL-CIO, and he said in interviews that UBI is an idea we, the union, like to play with, but they haven't really seen a solution that works. They kind of like the concept, but they don't believe in it, so they don't really care about it any further. So for the North in Canada, unions are pretty much in the same position, but a little more open. They are interested, but treat the idea with considerable caution, and for them it's generally too much a social policy reform. So specifically for the Ontario Basic Income pilot, the union said it's a thoughtful proposal. They were very interested in seeing how the whole situation would develop. All these quotes are from the Ontario Public Service Employees Union. They were interested in the outcomes of the pilot, but they said skepticism is warranted. They didn't believe that it would bring all these changes that were hoped for. And then I'll include one European country. I picked Germany because I am from Germany, and there's a pretty strong response already there, and pretty big debates. There's good amount of resources to use. So in Germany, there are already various proposals from all kinds of groups, so the debate is a little more mature than it is in North America. And unions also have a very clear opinion, and they're very clearly opposed to basic income. And the quotes that I'll be using for a lot of the later parts as well are from Verdi, which is kind of the service employees and public sector union, which is one of the biggest unions by numbers in Europe. And IG Metall is the metal workers, whole car industry, all that. And they're probably one of the most powerful unions in Europe. And they say basic income in general is an attractive, fascinating idea. They like the concept, but it's very dangerous to them. So a term that is used that I find very interesting is, they call it the Trojan horse of neoliberalism. And pretty much the thought is here. So basic income in general sounds like a great idea. You'll have a great concept. But it is only good if it is this emancipatory basic income that we've heard about with a pretty high payout. but it could also be really dangerous if it was more of a neoliberal concept, the likes of, say, Milton Friedman, where you have a relatively low payout and you cut all kinds of social services for it, and the poor people end up in a worse position than they were before. And that's what the unions in Germany are extremely afraid of. So let's take all these arguments from different unions in these countries and some others and put them into kind of an economic framework. So first of all, we have some financial questions, because the first question that is always asked when we come to basic income is, how can UBI be financed? And we've heard these kind of calculations. Pretty much the outcome is, it is possible if you really want to, but it will be expensive. And unions generally doubt the feasibility, saying it's very costly, more remote than ever, financing is insufficient, and it's not realistic, and if any, it would be this kind of neoliberal model with a low cost and a low payout that they don't want. The second question would be, who profits and who loses? So clearly, if you said basic income at poverty level, by definition you eliminate poverty. Of course, it's not that easy, but it would surely be a step forward for low and also low to middle income families, depending on how the proposal exactly looks. But the problem here is kind of that basic income has not much to offer to the vast majority of union members, because they're usually not at the very, very low end of the income scheme, because they're earning more than minimum wage. And the middle class is actually most likely to bear the main burden of financing the basic income, just because they're the biggest class, they have the biggest amount of earnings. So for the typical union clientele, it's maybe not as much of an advantage as it is for other groups, so they have a little trouble supporting it because of this, because it's just not as interesting for them. And then to come to the economic effects, specifically to the labor market, the first question is bargaining power, which Michael Howard has already touched upon a little bit, which is very good, so I can be faster at this. So for individuals, there's this new exit option that improves their bargaining power. Pretty much they can say no to a job, either for a short time or for a longer period, and they can use this option to say no to bargain for better pay and better working conditions. And there's also some different effects for low and high skilled workers, as we've heard before. And for unions, they first of all say that it's not really a resource of power for individuals, because the exit option is not that viable. You can't drop out of the labor market for that long, especially if the amount you get is not that high. And they also see the problem for themselves, that if you can bargain individually, you have less need for collective action. The question is here, how much does it really help you individually? But the risk is definitely there for them, that with basic income, people will be more individual, and there will be less need for a union. Another argument that can be made by people like Andrew Stern is that it could be used as a permanent strike fund, which is an interesting idea, but hasn't really been explored, and unions haven't really responded to it. So they're against it pretty much because they see a threat to their own power. Next question would be unemployment, always a big question when it comes to basic income. So the idea behind it here is that it would eliminate the unemployment trap, where nowadays, if you don't have a job, you usually receive some kind of unemployment benefits, but those will be cut entirely once you start working. So there's very little incentive to find work, especially if it is very low paid work. And with basic income, all this would be more flexible. You could transition in and out of the labor market a lot easier, because those benefits would not be cut immediately. The problem here is that unions address is that real change would only come across with complete deregulation. So this would allow employers to pay very low wages, so they could offer more jobs, so we'd have less unemployment and all this, and it would all be easier in terms of employment. But the problem here is that all these kinds of regulations that unions have fought for so long to be implemented would be cut. And they don't really want that, because it would be kind of bad work instead of good work. They don't want employment for any price at $2 an hour. They also address the problem of training and reintegration programs, which they are afraid will be cut as well, because basic income could kind of be used as an excuse to park people in unemployment. They would be given up. They would not be returned into the labor market. No one would help them to find a job. And that's a problem for unions, because they value work. And they generally see the risk that full employment as a goal will be given up, which is somewhat likely, because a lot of times basic income is framed as something for the world after work for everyone. And then the last issue in this would be wages. which is a very central issue but very hard to answer in theory, so there are pretty much two opposing powers that could happen. So you have the increased bargaining power for individuals, which should help them to increase their wages, say no to bad working conditions, and have an upward pressure on wages. Then we have the different effects for different skill levels. And then on the other hand, we have a downward pressure on wages because of the so-called combination wage, which pretty much means that today we always have the argument, okay, if you work full-time, you should be able to support your family and earn a living with that. But with the basic income, employers could say, okay, your living is already secured, I don't have to do that. I can pay you $2 an hour and it's still beneficial for you, you have an advantage out of that. And so you'll take the work, and that's a threat to the minimum wage, and especially if the minimum wage were to be abolished, we could end up with really low wages because of that whole argumentation, and that is what unions see as a threat. They don't really see that increased bargaining power, but they see the problem of downward pressure on wages. And then we'll kind of shift the perspective now and go into some more value arguments, because all these economic questions are important, but they're often very hard to clearly answer. And I think the main reason why unions so clearly oppose basic income in most countries is more because of value issues they have with it. So first of all is the role of the individuals. So unions are a communal organization, whereas basic income is individualistic. So there's a clear problem here that this doesn't really go together. Unions are afraid of a further atomization of society, and they say things like UBIG is the foundation for solidarity and collective action, which is what they are all about. And the value of work is also very important because work is central for unions. The German union says it's good for social integration, recognition, self-affirmation. It's so much more than just earning money. Whereas basic income makes work at least almost unnecessary. It greatly diminishes the value that we put on work. And that is a problem for unions because they see work as a right, something you want to do, that you want to have, versus a burden that you just pick up to earn money for groceries. So there's this difference in how work is perceived. And lastly, of course, there are issues of justice. Mainly it's an issue of needs-based justice. So what do you need to live well? What do you need to have a life and dignity versus merit-based justice, saying what do you deserve from what you contribute to society, how you work. And unions argue that there will be a new form of exploitation. It's not going to be the employer exploiting the employee anymore, but the idle exploiting the industrious. So the people that work, the people that are in the union, they will have the disadvantage while other people receive benefits. And so to conclude, overall, your arguments of unions are that basic income is not feasible, it will not deliver the promised benefits, it also limits the role and power of unions, and it is contradictory to their traditional union values. And overall, I would say these concerns are, for a good part, justified. They might be a little exaggerated sometimes, but there's definitely some truth to these claims. But there's also a lot of areas where we need more clarity, so I would recommend to push for experiments to have more tangible results, especially on issues like wages. And I would also say that it should be addressed in policy design. All these concerns that unions bring up should be addressed, so that would mean you push for a more union-compatible basic income, meaning that the payout is relatively high. You do not cut all kinds of social services instead of it. The minimum wage remains intact, all that. So it would be a more of an emancipatory basic income versus a neoliberal limited one. And lastly, to also frame basic income coherent with union values. So right now it is often perceived as something that will end the work society and our focus on work. And this might be a great aspect to basic income that is interesting to many people, but certainly not to unions. So whenever addressing unions specifically, I think it would be very beneficial to frame it as something that improves the conditions of work and that helps everyone, the middle class and the poor, and that will improve working conditions and not just abolish work altogether, to make it more appealing to both the union values and also their economic concerns. So that right now unions are against basic income, but I think there is a chance to make them more open to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Franziska. So next up is James Mulvale and Sid Frankel. from the University of Manitoba, and they'll be talking about basic income. What do public sector unions think?
Is this the clicker here?
Yes.
Okay, well, good afternoon, and thanks for sticking around. It's been a really interesting day, certainly a long day. This presentation, I think you're actually going to pick up echoes in my, oh, sorry, I need the mic, I guess. You're going to pick up echoes in this presentation that echo some of the things that Franziska just said, which I guess is a good thing. We're kind of researching the same kind of questions and coming to the same kind of general conclusions. First of all, I should acknowledge there's three of us involved in this research. Sid Frankel, who's with me, and another colleague from the University of Manitoba, Mohammed Khan, who couldn't make this particular conference. The three of us, we're doing this because we think the question of union support for basic income is very important, and we know there's been sources of resistance to basic income within the union movement, but it's really important to continue to engage with the labor movement. I was at a conference last week where a labor leader from British Columbia was talking about the absence of working people and unions from the green movement, the movement for ecological sustainability, and saying, you know, if social movements don't get working people on board, including unions, which represent working people, we're maybe shooting ourselves in the foot, and I think he has a point. So I just wanted to very quickly, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just run through kind of the terrain of organized labor in Canada, because I think it's important to understand the size and shape of unions, and that might help us explain parts of the labor movement that are interested and supportive of basic income, and other parts of the labor movement who are not. So, as you can see from these statistics, the unionization rates in Canada have fallen markedly, about 10% since 1981. And this has been especially the case with unionization rates among men. And this, of course, is related partly to changes in the labor market where traditionally highly unionized sectors have been in decline, such as construction and manufacturing, and I guess one might add mining in the Canadian context. But sectors with lower rates of unionization have been growing, such as retail, trade, and professional services. Okay, to move this ahead, I just this button here is a window. This button. I just do it on the down arrow. Is that going on this? Should work now. Thanks. On the other hand, public sector unionization rates have not fallen, and they remain relatively stable. It's most of the loss in labor union density, as I call it, has occurred in the private sector. And there's variations from province to province, as you would expect. Quebec and Newfoundland have the highest unionization rates. The labor movement is a very complicated terrain in Canada and in other countries. There's local, provincial, and national levels who are not necessarily addressing the same issues and may in fact have differing views on specific issues. There's labor central organizations like the Canadian Labour Congress or provincial federations, local labor councils, and also specific unions. And the labor movement in Quebec has always been quite autonomous of the labor movement in English-speaking Canada. So that's another factor to take into consideration. There's been rapid amalgamation of private sector unions. What used to be the Canadian Auto Workers, now Unifor, recently merged with the Communication, Energy, and Paper Workers Union, and that's just one example of kind of rapid amalgamation in the private sector of union serving employees in the private sector. In this particular study, we're focused on that sector of the labor movement in Canada that's remained relatively stable numerically, the large public sector unions, including the Canadian Union of Public Employees, the National Union of Provincial and Government Employees, the Federation of Nurses Unions, and the Postal Workers Union. Now, just thinking historically, and this has the most direct effect on thinking about basic income, I think in the Canadian labor movement generally has had a strong tradition of social unionism. Unions dedicated to the broader social good, to issues of social justice, to advocating for welfare measures that benefit everyone, not just organized labor. And of course this is opposed to the business unionist model that's just about collective bargaining and better wages and benefits at the work site. The kind of what he's called the Gomperist approach to union organization. So, I mean, this strong tradition of social unionism in Canada is something we can build on, I think, in reaching out to labor. The labor movement had a lot to do with the birth of Medicare, the birth of other important social programs, so we can draw on that tradition in seeking labor allies. There's always been a tension in the Canadian labor movement, and it certainly is not unique, between the more moderate and radical elements. And especially from the 20s to the 40s, many unions and union activists had strong links with the Communist Party. But from the sort of 1950s onwards, the labor has formed a strong sort of union, has formed a strong link with our Social Democratic Party, the NDP, and were involved in the founding of the NDP in 1961. Although there has been instances in the auto workers, now Unifor has certainly taken this tact on certain issues, urged the members to strategically support other parties in certain elections on certain issues. Now, there's sort of a history of labor movement skepticism and opposition to the idea of guaranteed or basic income. We had a commission in the 1980s called the Royal Commission on Economic Development, headed by Donald MacDonald, a former Liberal finance minister, and they made two big recommendations. One was for free trade with the US, which the government under Brian Mulroney implemented. The second recommendation was for overhaul of the income support system, including something they called the Universal Income Security Program. It was a very minimalist, very kind of bare bones approach to basic income, which would have done away with existing would have radically cut or done away with existing social insurance programs, such as what was used to call in those days unemployment insurance. When Franziska actually mentioned a researcher, Rodney Haddow, who looked at the Canadian labor movement's reaction to this recommendation, and they were very, very strongly opposed, and I think probably should have been, because I think arguably this proposal for basic income made in 1985 would have left the most economically vulnerable people in Canadian society worse off compared to the existing measures of social assistance and social insurance schemes. So that was that's something labor leaders in Canada remember vividly, older labor leaders at least, that MacDonald and his bunch tried to foist basic income in us in something called UISP on us in the 1980s. This basic income thing sounds very similar to that, so therefore it's likely not a good idea. Now, things have begun to change. In the 2016-2017 race for electing a new federal leader of the New Democratic Party, or Social Democratic Party, the successful candidate was Jagmeet Singh, who kind of came as a dark horse and actually won the leadership. But one of the candidates who ran a very credible campaign and he was a union economist before he was an MP, Guy Caron. He had as the central plank in his platform a proposal for basic income. And it was a refundable tax credit. It wasn't a purely universal Democrat version of basic income. But he had costed out. He talked about how we would pay for it through adjustments to the tax system. And it garnered some interest. Some of the other leadership candidates were skeptical about it. Singh, the eventual winner, was kind of silent on it. So we'll see where the NDP goes in the months and years ahead, especially as we approach the October federal election. There has been very strong opposition to basic income. The basic income pilot in the province of Ontario that was, I think the session earlier, people heard about how the Doug Ford government abruptly canceled the Ontario Basic Income Pilot Program in August 31st, 2018. The date is emblazoned in our brains. But before the change in government, before the cancellation, certain aspects of the union movement, especially QP Ontario, the provincial division of the Canadian Union of Public Employees, who represent, among others, workers, social service workers who administer the current income security support programs of the disability allowance and the Ontario Works, the social assistance program. They were very much opposed to this because they saw it directly tied to job layoff. So looking at this history, of course, the question is there now perhaps at this stage in time more openness to the basic income model, especially maybe among younger labor activists and leaders? Okay, I'm going to run through this fairly quickly, but try and highlight what we see as we sort of in the early stages of our data collection, or I guess propositions to be tested or hypotheses to be looked at more carefully, some of the frequently cited objections. Now, I thought we were very clever in coming up with this term, the neoliberal Trojan horse, but I see from Franziska's presentation, a German labor leader used it 2 years ago. So, but I think it's an apt descriptor of this objection that, oh, well, they're just going to bring in this basic income and start cutting other programs. And there's been an anti-poverty coalition in Ontario that's really played on this argument. It's called, or an organization called the Ontario Campaign Against Poverty. Now, a somewhat related, that's kind of the general objection, oh, well, they're just going to use it to do away with everything else. There's a more focused objection from some labor folks that, you know, it's not without credibility and has to be answered thoughtfully and respectably, that it would lead to the erosion of existing programs. It would, there'd be even worse versions of social assistance and also would mean downgrading of social insurance programs such as unemployment insurance. Well, I think the counter-argument to that one is that the neoliberal state has been cutting programs since about 1980, right? And for most of those years, basic income was not on the policy agenda, was not a topic for discussion. So they haven't needed basic income, you know, as sort of the straw man against which to make cuts to current programs. They're doing it anyway. So it's just time to think new thoughts, come up with a new paradigm, and think outside the box. There's the low-wage subsidy objection. I think, well, Franziska referred to this, that you know, this will drive wages down even further than they are now. I think ways to counter that argument might include the fact that, I mean, partly inspired and activated by the labor movement, we've had campaigns to raise the minimum wage, to put in place a living wage. I think arguably the successes of those movements has been very, very limited. So that strategy doesn't seem to be working. I think the other economic argument is that what's keeping wages down isn't kind of negotiations between people looking for jobs and employers willing to pay X amount of dollars per hour. I think things like automation and labor market restructuring are dampening down wage rates. So I don't think it's necessarily fair to claim that basic income will be the root of the furtherance of low wages. There's the layoffs of social service workers. I mentioned earlier, QP Ontario was very much opposed to the pilot project in Ontario. It's interesting, they have a document out that kind of portrays social service workers administering the existing social insurance or social welfare programs as advocates and case managers on the side of the client. Now, I think that's certainly the case in certain instances where individual workers are doing the right thing and are motivated by social justice ideals and trying to work the system as best they can to the advantage of their own clients. On the other hand, I think that critique, that objection ignores the fact that structurally social assistance and even to some extent disability pensions are there to, are kind of disciplinary measures against the poor. And there's also the argument that collective bargaining will be undermined, but once again, maybe it's time to think outside the box. And it also siphons off a pressure for government job creation. Well, once again, we've been talking about job creation as something government should do since the advent of neoliberalism, and guess what? They're not doing it after 35 years. So. And related to some of these, I don't have time to go into a lot of detail, but maybe we can pick up on some of this during the discussion. The version of basic income that's been most talked about in Canada has been the refundable tax credit, negative income tax approach. And Labour objects that this is selective, divisive, and stigmatizing. And once again, there may be some truth in that objection, so we have to take it seriously. The political feasibility objection, it's unaffordable and it would just lead to an inadequate level. I think those questions have been addressed in interesting ways in Mike's presentation just a few minutes ago. And finally, the marketization objection, that it's a consumerist approach that supports market reform rather than the reform of the welfare state. I think there's lots of evidence to indicate that when people that are most economically vulnerable get a basic income, they spend it on necessities. They don't spend it on superfluous or things that perhaps create chains of production that are environmentally damaging, things like that. So, okay, we'll leave it at that and maybe pick up on some questions later. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for that presentation, Jim. And do you want to get this set up here? So next up is Peter Frase, who's on the editorial board of Jacobin and author of For Futures, Life After Capitalism.
Thanks. Yeah, thanks. All right. So, thanks. Thank you. After all that, I don't know, I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction. And I'm glad we heard so much about sort of some of the more detailed mechanics that Michael talked about, and also the view, particularly the empirical research into the view particularly of unions and of labor, which is important to me. And I'm going to maybe talk about this at the level more of a sort of a political, conceptual level that gets at what was called sort of the values question, you could put it, but there's other ways to put it. To contextualize how I come to this topic and to be in this room, I've been studying basic income, writing about it, advocating it for maybe 10, 15 years, and I come to this as a socialist, as someone who was interested in basic income from a time when it was a fairly small and marginal demand, not to many people in this room or to this organization, but it had a fairly minor presence even on the left, and of course the left itself had a more minor presence 15 years ago than it does today. And I thought basic income as a demand and an interesting and a compelling way to raise certain critiques of tendencies on the left, particularly the ones represented, particularly in the German labor movement, but also we see the Canadian and the American labor movement, which tended to valorize a narrow definition of work, while wage labor as an inherently desirable thing, jobs as a desirable thing, and as the workplace as sort of the center of left organizing, and the idea of basic income as providing the unconditional means of subsistence was a way to critique that. But now, when you have this sort of much wider, the appearance of basic income ideas sort of right, left, and center of various kinds, and you have a debate within the left, as we've seen, about whether this is a desirable demand a desirable idea, and also you have within the right this sort of pro and anti-basic income debate, which I'm going to try to sort of contextualize in this too, because I think it's important for me to understand how do I still think about basic income as a demand, as an idea. And I think part of the problem, what I want to sort of say in the brief time that I have here, is that a lot of the debates about basic income end up being rather frustrating because they skip over some of the fundamental premises and assumptions about both what a basic income should look like, but also why it is that we argue for it. So recently, I'm going to get into this time, through recently Darren Acemoglu, the well-known sort of mainstream economist, wrote a popular article about why basic income is a bad idea. That he would even write this indicates that it's in the conversation in a way that it wasn't before. And the article was sort of rehearsed a bunch of routine objections, many of which we've heard already about the economic and political objections and why it's, well, he didn't say neoliberal because he's probably in favor of that, but, basically those objections. But what was interesting to me more was a response that came out, that I'm going to sort of use to frame this, from Ingrid Robijns, the Dutch social scientist, who has written a lot about basic income. And this is just from a blog post that she wrote within the last week or so at Crooked Timber that you can find, that draws on stuff she's written in English and Dutch about this. And what she points out is that things like this Acemoglu article and like a lot of objections that you get to basic income don't really systematically talk about some basic levels on which we should really define what we're talking about when we're talking basic income. And I think the debate both within the left and between left and right about basic income makes a little more sense when we conceptualize it in these terms. So I'm going to walk through 4 sort of points she says that you really need to address when you're talking about basic income. The bold is just my terms for these, not hers, but the quoted parts are Ingrid Robijns directly. So the first, like most fundamental thing that often we don't get into, I find, in these debates is make explicit what the goals are that a basic income is supposed to meet, or the problems one hopes it will solve, and what values are taken to be at stake, and how those values are understood and conceptualized. So, for example, is the point primarily of a basic income to alleviate poverty, which is sometimes how it's posed? Is it to deal with mass unemployment caused by automation, in which case we need to debate whether that's empirically real or avoidable? Is it to shore up or to replace the welfare state? Is it fundamentally something which stabilizes or undermines capitalism as a social formation, which is, I think, the key thing that I'm going to come back to? And all of these, these different kinds of, the perspectives you get often stem from different assumptions about what the goals are. And that goes for both the advocates and the opponents of basic income. And so from there, then you have to also talk about the empirical assumptions that are made, as Robijns puts it. And when she's talking about assumptions, a lot of what she seems to be talking about is assumptions about what the effect of having a basic income will be. And these can often push in sort of different directions. For example, does it lead to people dropping out of the labor force? And if so, to what degree? And if so, to what degree is that a good or a bad thing? Does it lead people to be more able to be engaged in organizing collectively, either in the workplace or in the community, because people have, the universal strike fund, as was mentioned, or as fall back on? Or is it this neoliberal payoff that causes people to be more sort of disorganized, right? So that's an important thing. I think this step is less about something there are assumptions, and in some ways there's a sort of a human experiment that we're calling for when we're calling for basic income, but we should be clear about what the sort of at least guesses are that we're making about which direction basic income leads. And then that leads us into the things that I think we more often talk about while skipping over these first 2 steps, like implementation, as in how much should it be, how are we going to pay for it, what are we cutting or not cutting for basic income, and related to that, the sort of trade-offs about other policy options. So should we be focusing on other kinds of public services rather than basic income? Both in economic terms, is there something else we should be doing? In political terms, is there something else that's more winnable? And so I find myself now in the position less of sort of being just an advocate for basic income within the left, which is how I thought of myself maybe 10 years ago, and more as someone who's trying to situate myself as being for basic income thought of in a certain way, but also a critic of, I think, what we see increasingly as sort of the neoliberal basic income, the right-wing basic income. And so I'm going to step into a kind of convoluted chart, which I'm going to sort of walk through a little bit, how the left, right, and pro and anti-UBI debate works out for me, or how I think about it in terms of these bigger conceptual parameters of like what is basic income and what is it for. So as I said, there's a pro and anti-basic income tendency, but then the pro and the anti each have a left and a right, which are united and divided in certain ways. And so when I'm talking about where I sort of come from, the pro-basic income left, I'm talking about a type of pro-basic income advocacy that stems from, for example, the old Van Parijs and Van der Veen capitalist road to communism thought experiment in some ways, or more recently, Kathy Weeks in The Problem with Work, making a Marxist feminist argument for the basic income as something that is tied to ultimately the transcendence and abolition of wage labor. The argument that contra certain kinds of socialist and labor traditionalists thought that having, to quote Marx, to be a productive worker is not a piece of luck but a misfortune. And so we should be thinking about this as a way of carving out, even if basic income is not something that actually abolishes wage labor overall, by opening up that space, both materially in terms of the money, but also in terms of the principle of people should be guaranteed access to what they need to live completely independent of work or any other requirement, is sort of the core principle there. And that is united with what I call the right UBI, and also what I would say, I sort of classify certain kinds of liberal, anti-poverty kinds of arguments for basic income sort of as right arguments in a certain way, which are arguments that do not see it as fundamentally undermining capitalism, see it as in fact propping it up as a way of saying if we don't do basic income, then there's going to be chaos because of automation throwing people out of work and so on, but this is a way to stabilize everything. What the right and sort of left pro-basic income advocates share, I would argue, is a sort of not necessarily hostility to capitalist wage labor, but at least a sort of a lack of political attachment to it. Whether it's sort of the right saying, well, if people are automated out of their jobs, we give them a basic income and then they'll be fine, and that's fine, and they'll do whatever they want to do. They'll either work to top it up or they won't. And the left saying this is the seed of our larger critique of we do not think that human lives being based on alienated and exploited labor, where you're working for someone else, is what we want. And so it's like I share with the right pro-basic income advocates and sort of a hostility to that more traditional labor valorization of the job and of work, but I see it as a sort of a subversive, undermining kind of demand and not as a stabilizing demand. And so I share with the kind of anti-basic income labor left the non-capitalist value of collective power and solidarity and a basic right to human needs for everyone as the fundamental value, and I'm in no way interested. And so for this reason, I'm not as interested in these questions of how do we set up a basic income as a policy that will work, make all the numbers add up, and become a viable system that works in the long run. In my view, attempts to compromise between the needs of the working class and the needs of the capitalist class are inherently not viable. That's why we got the period of neoliberal reaction we're living through now, and it's why ultimately a basic income or any other kind of growth of social provision, whether in the form of services or in the form of a basic income, is ultimately is going to lead to conflict and struggle, economic and political crisis. So the few minutes left here, and so I just want to flesh out, I guess, a little more how I see the sort of the other side of this debate occurring on the left and the right. So you basically have heard already what the left anti-basic income case is in various ways. And I think, again, the more interesting aspects of that critique are not the you can't make the numbers add up version, because there are answers to that I think are compelling. It's more these things like, well, people, there's a value in having a job that goes beyond the money. That's an argument that you get in a left version from unions saying that this is a source of meaning and a source of community and a source of solidarity. You get it in its right version saying that essentially, there's a sort of like almost like a religious command or a sort of a Protestant work ethic kind of thing that says that people should have to work. It doesn't matter whether the work is socially useful. It doesn't really matter, how good the job is or how well it's paid. Work is good for you, and it's And so on the right, if you read right-wing arguments about basic income, they break down on those sort of lines. The sort of more libertarian, we should just do this because it's the most economically efficient, versus the, no, there's a moral reason not to do this. And so, I guess I want to just sort of end it up with sort of where I find myself now in the left debate, or the larger political debate about basic income, which is as still a person who believes in, real freedom in the sense of not just the abstract freedom to be, to be able to, say what I want without the cops shutting me down, but also the material ability to do what I want, to get what I want, to have housing, to have healthcare, and so on. And I want to do that through winning things like, but not limited to, the basic income that detach our access to the means of survival and the means of flourishing from having a job, whether that's the government-created job of the job guarantee that's now also become more popular, or whether that's in the form of just working for the private boss. But I just want to sort of end by highlighting what I think is the interesting kind of cross current that cuts here. I've shown the sort of what unites us on the left, pro or anti-basic income, and what unites people on the left and right in certain ways who are pro-basic income, even if we have different views of it. But what I think is interesting in some ways is that, so I find myself in this position. I'm for basic income from the left, so I'm not for let's privatize everything except for basic income, as some on the right would have it. And I reject some of these traditional labor arguments that say, well, that yes, it's actually a neoliberal Trojan horse and so on. And then what I find myself saying to the sort of or not saying to, because it's not so much that I want to have a conversation with them, but what I find interesting about my relationship to the anti-basic income right is that they're the ones who are saying, this is a deeply subversive to our social formation, our kind of capitalist patriarchal way of life. So for example, the well-known finding that in something like the Mincome experiment, that a basic income makes it easier for women to leave bad marriages, for example, which is an empirical observed fact, which to a left, certainly like a left feminist pro-basic income person like Kathy Weeks, and to me, that's a good thing. To the anti-basic income right, it's a bad thing because it challenges the nuclear family. And so, right on time, as I come to the end, that's the sort of the deep lesson to me of where I find myself in this chart is that I have certain agreements and disagreements with the pro-basic income right and the anti-basic income left, and then I find myself looking at this sort of the conservative anti-basic income faction and saying, you know what, they're I hope right that basic income is or can be a subversive plot to undermine the work ethic, destabilize capitalism, and destroy the family, because I think that would be good.
All right, thanks, Peter. So let's do a Q&A now, and I guess I'll walk around with the mic and see if that works, and take questions. So I'll head to the back first.
I guess just sort of a follow-up question to you, Peter, because I think I agree, especially with what you just said. How do you think then about forming coalitions to make your vision of basic income a reality when, as you say, you find that you agree with the basic income right on some things, agree with the anti-UBI left on some things, but really only agree with the anti-UBI right on the, I don't want to say the facts, but what you hope is the reality of the situation.
Are we just going to do one at a time, or do we?
Yeah, we're just going to do one at a time.
This is on? Yeah, here we go. Thanks. So in terms of political coalitions, I think this is a key question now that we find basic income bubbling up into more and more mainstream debates. And I think, to me, the important thing now is to really think carefully about what questions we need to be asking if we're forming coalitions, whether it's to advocate for policy or to promote the idea of basic income. And it just comes down to things such as, what does it replace? And this gets into, of course, the debate, basic income versus universal basic services. People and so I think the critique of people like, for example, Barbara Bergman, who say, you know, we should just be talking about high quality childcare and universal health care and education, and those things have to come first. I don't think we necessarily have to prioritize it that way, and I think that there's a value to, you know, the sort of almost symbolic, but I don't want to say symbolic meaning, but some partially symbolic meaning of basic income as this universal unconditional principle of everyone should have a right to whatever they need to survive, that neither a boss nor, you know, a bureaucrat is telling them. But that, yeah, we can't, you know, we have to make sure we're not getting in bed with the sort of, you know, Charles Murray plan to replace the welfare state, meaning you get a basic income and then you have to spend it to buy your, you know, your housing and your health care and your education. Because then it is the neoliberal Trojan horse. That's garbage and I want nothing to do with it. And so it's really, I think, as simple as, you know, getting past the headline, basic income headline, and saying not so much not like the accounting of like how exactly you're going to pay for it, but more the big picture of, you know, are we talking about, to use the description that was used by this group, the Undercommons from Los Angeles, that published a little essay in the Boston Review where they distinguish between they called basic income plus and basic income minus. Basic income plus is basically we take or build on what we have in terms of, you know, we getting to universal health care, free education, stuff like that, but the basic income can, you know, as Michael sort of talked about, you know, can be the thing that gets you the residual of the other stuff you need, versus UBI minus, which is this take away everything else, replace it with the basic income. And so, yeah, 10 years ago I would have said, you know, that was not such I wasn't so worried about drawing that distinction. Now I'm very concerned about drawing that distinction.
So this is really for anyone who has thoughts on it. But with Andrew Yang being a more and more prominent person, who is a person now many people are learning about basic income for the first time from him. I mean, he's been on the Breakfast Club and some pretty major things. And maybe you especially, how has the left's reaction been to his presidency? Is there concern that a candidate who supports UBI, he's setting the mold for that, and that it can't change, or that? Because he's definitely, from what I've seen, made some people on the left very angry in certain instances. So, any thoughts on that at all?
I can't say what the left reaction to Yang has been because I'm not familiar with what people have specifically said, but he got a lot of right-wing people enthusiastically showing up on his website, and he actually kind of disavowed support from them because he doesn't want to be seen that way. But that may be part of what is worrying some people on the left. As far as his setting a mold that we can't have it any other way than his particular plan, I mean, I would be really astonished if Andrew Yang became the Democratic nominee for president. And I think, you know, he's running for president, and I think he's serious, but he's doing it to get basic income on the agenda. And so we'll have a conversation, and that conversation doesn't have to be frozen around his particular proposal. We could talk at some length about the pros and cons of it, so that's what I would say. If anybody wants to add.
I think it might be relevant to your question. In Canada, I mean, I guess the party that's passed the most resolutions and actually done the most serious pilot in recent years, at least, has been the Liberal Party, not our more left party, the Social Democrat, you know, the NDP. So I think there's, you know, you can find allies. This goes back to the previous question. You can find allies in the political center too to move things forward.
Yeah, and I would just say quickly, like, to me, like, in certain ways, Andrew Yang is like a gift to the anti-basic income left, because he's like, can be very easily portrayed as just like a hashtag neoliberal Trojan horse, which is not totally fair. I mean, he's not quite like Charles Murray, but he comes out of what I call sort of the pragmatic capitalist basic income. It's like you could also look at, like I had a quote from him that on a slide I didn't show. You could also talk about like Martin Ford, the business writer who wrote Rise of the Robots a few years ago, who, Yang, talks about like preventing social unrest and things like that because of automation. It's this very much like, this is a tool to sort of stabilize the disruptions of capitalism, and I think that has problems both politically and also empirically in terms of the automation stuff, but I don't want to go on and on about it, but that's my brief thought about it.
This question is for Franziska and James. It sounds like the part of UBI that unions have objected to is the unconditionality, and they sort of like programs that focus on work. I'm curious if that's your correct read, or if they're also concerned about cash versus non-cash, and sort of how that ties in with their potential support, or, EITC has it has a phase-in, so I imagine they're more supportive of that than welfare programs, or maybe the Alaska Permanent Fund. I don't know if you've done research there. So.
I don't think that they have much of a problem with the unconditionality. So in Germany, there's already a program that's pretty much like a basic income, so you get about $400 a month if you don't have a job, plus your housing is paid for, and there's a lot of conditions on that right now, and they've been fighting to get those conditions off. So I think it's less of an envy debate too much. It's more of a risk that it costs so much that the burden is on the middle class, but I don't have an inherent problem with giving money to the poor, I would say.
I think, I agree. I don't think that their main objections actually have to do with the characteristics of a basic income. I think their main concerns have to do with effects on the labor market. Will it have the kind of atomized response, adding power to individual workers rather than collective power? And I think they're concerned about what it might do to their membership and their own power to act for workers.
And can I get some more hands so I can make a note of this mentally? And do we have any some women's perspective questions too? Okay. Well, here I'll just go to Almon's first.
Here I am.
It was played for you.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate everybody's talks, and I really liked, Peter, your diagram. I thought that was very helpful. I wanted to ask a question. I guess it's for everybody, but sort of directed to the presentations about unions, because one of the things that was mentioned as a concern by unions about basic income is that it could potentially push wages down. So the question I have is not really about the unions, but about those of us in the basic income movement. Because it seems to me like there's a tension in the movement where we argue for a basic income because we have a desire for individual autonomy. We want to promote individual autonomy. But we still have a tendency to look to the government or industry as job creators. So my question is, if the basic income is high enough, do we really care how low wages go? Or do we care about whether the government will be involved in job creation? Because if we have a basic income that's high enough, don't we then, as individuals, regain the power, or maybe not regain, we never had it, but gain the power to create the economies that we want through our spending, investment, and active choices about what we do with our time, once we have our control over our time back to us and from capital?
I think we do care, and our unions do care, not so much because it's the amount of money that we get and the amount of money we end up having in total in our pockets, but it's kind of the argument you made earlier that we want the basic income be financed by capital, not only by labor, and so the unions don't want to let the employers let them go with a really low wage to pay for the work. They want them to pay a fair price. And so I think it's more about where the money is coming from and getting a fair share from employers or from those that already have much.
But through wages or through unconditional redistribution?
So I think if you could effectively tax them on their capital gains or anything. That might be a way out, but I don't think that's too realistic. I don't think unions see that too much, so it's more of a safe option to do it the traditional way through wages, versus having to try to come up with a tax system that they can probably easily get out of by relocating or anything like that.
Yeah, I think you've got your finger on a basic dilemma. I think the basic income movement is agnostic about where the basic income comes from. So that money from the state is as good money as money from labor. I don't think the labor movement is agnostic about that. I think they have a central value, which we might call the dignity of work, and that money that comes through labor, if you will, is better money. I think that's an essential dilemma for the basic income movement in working with organized labor, and I think it cries out for a kind of co-production approach, that somehow the two movements have to get together and try to build a kind of basic income that satisfies both movements if labor is really seen as an important ally.
Thank you. You walked me right into what I wanted to say, which is that it seems to me a lot of the problems with labor are due to the fact that it's framed in the wrong way, as someone in the last session I was in pointed out, but I want to frame it on the full employment side. And I want to say that we shouldn't be talking about whether we need basic income or a full employment guarantee. We should be talking about the fact that we need both together, and that each one is necessary, and jointly they're, if not sufficient, at least take us a long way towards a better society and towards resolving these kinds of problems. Because I think it's true that the labor union is quite right to talk about the dignity of work. I believe in the dignity of work myself. That doesn't mean people have to take paid labor. It means people should be productive in some part of their lives. Hopefully most people will be productive in some part of their lives. And so I want to call attention to the difference between talking, I'm here representing a new organization which I just made up today. It's the North American Employment Guarantee Congress. I'm the only member of it right now. And I want to distinguish my Congress from the North American Employment Requirement Congress, which is the way everyone here is talking about full employment, as if there's going to be a requirement that you work. No, put them together and say everyone gets a basic income, fine, we can talk forever, or not forever, but hopefully we can figure out where to put that, but there has to be a floor, and anyone who wants to work should be able to find a job, and that makes the government the employer of last resort. And it's a much more radical proposal because it has to go together with a tax system which is much more robust than the kind of tax system that you need for basic income.
If I can make one comment, others may want to comment. I really worry about framing, I really worry about seeing quote-unquote full employment as a goal, because it's not an issue we're addressing in this particular session. But I think there's a very strong argument, the green argument for basic income, that UBI is a necessary but not sufficient condition to transition to, in wealthy capitalist countries, a much smaller economy, where we consume less, where we have, everybody's guaranteed an economic floor, a minimal dignified standard of living, but we have to be degrowing and consuming less and doing things to preserve the environment. I think it's the social ecological transition argument. And I think in Canada right now there's a push on to frame a Green New Deal for Canada, and I'm a little bit worried about whether that will go down, calling for full employment as a goal, because I think that can be ecologically damaging.
I've been debating with myself whether I should ask this question or not, but I'm going to ask it. First, I'm in a union. I'm pro-union. I'm in one. I like unions. But I think in the U.S., like private sector unionization is down to about 4%. Is that 3 or 4%? It's pretty low. This is a real question. I mean, like, why? Like, there seems to be this assumption that we need to somehow bring unions on board for this to happen. Do we?
Probably in the US less than in other countries. For Canada, I think you would. For any European country, you would have to, for sure. But I would just like to add one observation I made to that, and that is that I found that unions that are weak seem to be a little more open to basic income than unions that are strong. I think it is because they have more to lose. Like in Germany, there's a strong social services, or in Finland, it's the same situation that they could lose with a basic income, whereas in the US, I think it could be more of a chance for unions as well because they are so weak, but it's also because they also don't pick up the topic very much because they're busy with dealing with their own problems, and there could be an argument to it that they're not as necessary here to get it through.
I think even though the union density has declined, if you want the kind of progressive basic income some of us have been talking about, and you don't have the unions, then that means the left is divided between the basic income advocates and the unions. And then what's likely to come out of that is no basic income, or you're going to get the neoliberal Trojan horse version. So it's certainly worth the effort, even though, you know, as we've heard, there's deep suspicion and hostility and indifference in the unions, but it's really worth the effort to have the conversation there.
I just want to make a quick note to from Franziska. I just think it's funny that if it's true that like weaker unions should be more interested, what really confuses me is that in the US, the freelancers union has yet to embrace basic income. It seems to me like just a complete slam dunk obvious thing for freelancers, which would massively benefit from basic income, to take it out, and yet they haven't.
Andrew Stern in his book is arguing for exactly that, and I don't know either why they haven't looked into it yet.
Hi, this question for Mike. I really appreciated your talk, and I think it was a very honest presentation of Lucas and his partner paper. And I think it's very important for us, basic income intellectuals and activists, to try to engage with these type of intellectuals which are not really very hostile to basic income, but they want to have a very structured and sincere debate. And actually I also read Ingrid Robin's paper, and I think she shows the way of how to debate. Thanks a lot for resuming her arguments. So my question was really, what was for you, Mike, the most convincing objection of these people, which are, you know, Rawlsians, left-wing, very interesting left-wing intellectuals, very honest and powerful, and how can we engage with them in a way which could convince them to change their minds? It wasn't clear in your paper, in your presentation, which was the most powerful objection for you. Thanks.
I think I'm still sorting through that myself. What grabbed me when I read the Lucas Stanczyk and Alex Gurevich piece was the idea that, in fact, they're actually very sympathetic to basic income in the long run. If you think of Marx's higher phase of communism, they say, we want a basic income there because it will ensure that in a society where the means of production are collectively owned, people aren't coerced into employment, they embrace it freely. But then there will be a more egalitarian structure within which they're working. They just don't think we have the power to get it now, and the kind we'll get is not likely to be the kind we want. And we have the illusion that because there's rising interest in basic income, and you've got people from Milton Friedman to Martin Luther King who've been in favor of it, we're going to have a broad coalition. Well, I don't think we're going to have a broad coalition when we spell out the details. if you have a kind of basic income that really does make it a lot easier for people to say no to employment, then the industrialists that are in favor of some kind of basic income are saying, well, no way. The National Association of Manufacturers, back when the Nixon administration was talking about a guaranteed income, they said, we've got to have work requirements. They were adamant because they said, if you don't have that, then you're not going to have a disciplined workforce. So I do think that there's a serious challenge here, and we have to confront the difficulty we face getting the kind of basic income that's going to be liberatory. And sometimes we just kind of gloss over those differences. So that's, I think, it's a kind of a wake-up call to look at the details. And the Robbins article that Peter mentioned, I recommend that to everybody because she poses the questions we really need to hone in on and address more seriously than we've done. And now that it's getting on the policy agenda, we'd better get all of our ducks in line or we're going to be steamrolled over one way or the other.
I'm not too sure what I'm going to say, but I just need to say something because unions historically started by hearing the voice of those that are vulnerable. Yes. And organizing and giving voice. And it's that voice that's missing. It's hard to hear the word power as opposed to voice. And as the role of unions as a negative. Because in terms of women's issues, I don't know in the States, I've got to assume that that breaks for women, for childcare, all those kinds of things came from unions. And if we cannot, some did, okay? In Canada, some did, okay? Okay, so that's where there's a difference there. But wages, I'm sorry, there must have been some union movement to increase wages for women. Obviously, there's disagreement there. That's where I say I don't know what I'm saying exactly, but there needs to be a change of consciousness. A consciousness of that when we're in jobs that we're working as union workers and management tells us to do things that we should not be doing in our ethics, that gets rid of doing something that isn't for those of us that are working to help the oppressed, whatever. We need to be able to lay down our tools, and we need to be able to stand strong. And we can do it through unions. And can we do it with creating allies with basic income so that we maintain connection and consciousness that our goal is to work for and with people who are suffering in our society.
I think one response to Penny's very important point is that how do we bring voices that aren't yet being heard in the labor movement into the conversation? And this includes workers in the most precarious kinds of jobs. One thing the Canadian Union of Postal Workers is currently doing is trying to organize bike couriers, who have, of course, historically not been organized. And I think if we bring folks in those kind of sectors into the labor movement, maybe there'll be some more interest in really innovative policy ideas like basic income, because it was the labor movement that came up with most of the other social policy innovations we enjoy today. CUP-W was on the forefront of fighting for maternity leave benefits, paternity, what we now think of as parental leave, Medicare, the list goes on and on. So those voices need to be heard, but we need to bring people into the labor movement to make their voices heard.
So basically in overtime here, but we're at the end. So I mean, I'm open for asking new questions if the panel's open for answering new questions, because there are some more out here. Are you up for a panel?
I guess this is for maybe Franziska. I'm curious what the response of labor unions in Germany have been to the increased flow of immigrants into Europe. And I guess I'm prefacing that because it seems to me that my own ambivalence about the union movement, I think, is informed by David Redinger's work on the wages of whiteness. And that in a lot of ways, it wouldn't surprise me that the German unions maybe are falling into kind of a Gomper's attitude where they're protecting their own, and that kind of solidarity only exists within a relatively homogeneous population. So I mean, that kind of explains the success of unions maybe in Europe, and yet at the same time, and explains its kind of bigger failure in the United States.
I had to think about what their reaction actually was, and I think that points me towards saying that they tried to not have too much of a reaction. They didn't openly say anything of one or the other side. I think they were generally more embracing helping the refugees, and especially being a counterpoint to the AfD, the right-wing party, but they weren't too loud on this whole issue, probably because they were also trying not to lose some people, especially males in precarious jobs, something like that. But they were certainly not speaking out against refugees, but they weren't at the forefront of supporting it.
Okay, so I've been informed that we've got a union labor force here, so we gotta call it quits after all. So thank you for coming to this final session, and we'll see you tomorrow.